Daniel speaks about this great tribulation and says, there shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence, and there never shall be. Daniel 12:1. But the Lord also assures us of this, and that it will be great anguish which never occurred and will never shall be. But this is clearly the anguish of the end of times, from the great temptations during the presence of the Antichrist especially, and people will need to live far away from the cities. The trials will be so numerous, economic in nature, and people will need to abandon the cities and their livelihood. People will leave their normal lifestyle. Remember the catacombs of the first 3 centuries. The Christians fled towards the desert. The book of the Revelation spells this out. The woman with the child fled to the desert. The church will find asylum in the desert, in the holes of the earth. It will find refuge in the mountains and hills. The church will flee. And it does. It flees, and it always flees through the centuries. Where was divine liturgy celebrated? In countries of fierce persecution, such as Russia, Romania, China, Cambodia, where liturgy was still, and it's still, forbidden. Liturgy was celebrated in the woods, in the forests, in homes, in basements, in the holes of the earth. So these trials are numerous, and not only economic in nature, but tortures, incarcerations, concentration camps, forms of torture inconceivable to us. Surely, if you read the life of a martyr, you will find the description of his or her martyrdom. Today, we have contemporary methods, contemporary tortures enhanced by technology. I must tell you this. Up to a century or 2 centuries ago, the torture refers to the body mainly. Now we have psychological torture. We have methods of torture that tear up the psycho-emotional balance of a person. They alter the personality or the conscience. Back then, you could be breathing your last from the dismemberment of your body, but you were fully conscious. You never lost your awareness. Today, my friends, with the aid of psychiatric methods and modern behavior-altering drugs, you can lose your personality very, very quickly. What can you do then when your willpower can be shattered? All these methods are common knowledge today. The truth is that today's tortures are physical but also psychological, and the second ones are more dangerous because they can bring irreparable harm to the human personality. So the desert from this point on will be the place of refuge for the Christians who are at the receiving end of all types of pressure, persecution, whether political or cultural. Cultural persecution, when the human civilization will have reached such measure of decadence to have someone come to the point to say, no, I can no longer remain among these people inside this type of world. This is how the desert of the early ascetics came to be. The church will seek refuge in the desert again, my friends. The desert was a necessity not only in the first centuries, but the church will seek refuge in the desert again in the last days, during the days of the Antichrist. The catacombs were utilized back then, and they will be used again, not to mention that they're already being used during our days in Orthodox lands, and this is 1980. Today in Orthodox Russia, as we read in various periodicals, if the faithful wish to celebrate a divine liturgy, a liturgy in the true sense that would fulfill the needs of the faithful, they celebrate it in the forests and in the deserts. And if you would like to know how long one of these Russian divine liturgies last, they uphold the typicon, or the format, of the Holy Mountain. You will be horrified. 12 to 13 hours in the woods, in the cold. This is the meaning of heroism. The church has fled to the desert once again. Again, this information is common knowledge, and it is written in newspapers, religious magazines, and periodicals. We read these things. That's where I read this information, and I'm sharing it with you. For this reason, we need to start preparing ourselves, because at some point we may be faced with such a possibility to seek refuge in remote and deserted areas. St. Andrew of Caesarea writes the following: "What was happening with the martyrs, so it will be with the Antichrist. And this we saw during the Old Testament, when the faithful took refuge in the caves, in the mountains, and in the holes of the earth to avoid the wrath of the ancient types of the Antichrist." In the Old Testament, the Antichrist was at work because the Holy Cross was also at work. I have told you this in other lessons. The uncreated energy of the Holy Cross was at work in the Old Testament, and consequently the God-opposing powers of Satan, or the devil, were also at work. St. Paul writes about this very thing in the Epistle to the Hebrews, that the saints and the faithful went and made their abode in the caves and in the holes of the earth to be saved, of whom the world is not worthy. Did you hear? The world is not worthy, my friends. And I'm saying this because, should I tell you? Yes, I might as well tell you. One of our today's psychiatrists expressed his views about monasticism to an unfortunate young man who made it to his door. "Don't pay attention to what the monks do," he says, "because they feed donkeys. They're good for feeding donkeys, according to this scientist." Very nice. Please forgive me for this insertion. But you see, this is what monks do. They might as well be feeding donkeys. Well, what can you say? I am bringing this up because St. Paul says that the world is not worthy of those who seek refuge to the deserts, to preserve their Orthodox mindset and their faith in Jesus Christ. And St. Andrew says, "Ikos deke tin aesthetin erimon." This may include the actual desert. Did you hear this? The actual desert, the real desert, not the desert in a spiritual sense, where we can live a deserted lifestyle in our home, isolated, where our home becomes like the desert. He means the actual, real desert. In one of his homilies, the theologian Mr. Soteropoulos said this when he spoke about some of these topics of the book of the Revelation. I believe he told you this because he also mentioned it to me, something to this regard. Father Athanasios, when the time comes, we will head for the mountains and the deserts. Very true indeed. As St. Andrew says, here, the actual desert. This may include the actual desert. And St. Anthimos of Jerusalem writes, "Who will give me wings like a dove so I can fly away and find rest? Behold, I traveled a long distance running away. I made this desert my abode." This psalm, according to Anthimos of Jerusalem, prophesies the fleeing and the deliverance of the righteous from the snares of the devil, and their isolation and their redemption and their freedom from worldly cares, and there they will be assisted with divine aid and divine protection. As you see, my friends, this is the journey of the faithful inside history. How do you like it? if we chose to be Christians, let's praise God's holy name, because on the other side of these sufferings, at the end of this road of distress, Christ is coming. The Lord said, after all these things that I told you, raise your heads towards heaven and wait for your redemption. Wait for your redemption from there, because your redemption will take place from heaven. The world remains ignorant of the end of history. The faithful know it. They are certain of it. Not only that, but they sense the end galloping towards us, as Mr. Bratsiotis writes in his commentary very beautifully. Όσοι πιστοί, all those who are faithful, let's enter this adventurous and cross-bearing journey of the Church.
Слава Отцу и Сыну и Святому